Hello everybody and welcome back to Embroidery Tutorials, where we are stitching through my 90 variation chain stitch sampler. First, I would like to note that I have altered my filming style for this. Instead of doing the regular flat lay style, I will be doing more sideways angles for all of the videos on Circle 3. This allows me to not only sit down while I stitch, which is a massive lifesaver on my back, but also it allows me to get actually much closer shots that show you a lot more detail. The downside is that I'm having to play around with focus more, and it's definitely not perfect in this series of videos. It is something I will be working on and getting better at as I experiment with different angles. But if you loved the straight down shots, let me know in the comments. If you're loving these closer shots from sort of a side angle, let me know that, and I will try to utilize all of your opinions as I move forward with the rest of these tutorials. Moving on to the content of today's video, we are starting the third circle of this tutorial, which is made up of 7 different circles taking you through 90 variations of the basic chain stitch. But this circle itself is going to be starting with Interlocking Chain Fill. And this again is a stitch that I don't know that I invented it. I'm sure somebody else has thought of it at some point, but I haven't seen this stitch anywhere else, this style of using chain as a fill while interlocking all of the chains with each other. I haven't seen this anywhere, so this is a title that I came up with on my own. If you have seen anyone do this stitch before, or you've seen it by a different name, I would love to know what you know about it. But for now, we're going to be calling it Interlocking Chain Fill Stitch, so let's get started. The first thing we're going to do to fill this segment with chain stitch, which we're doing a circle here, you could do any kind of shape using this interlocking fill stitch, but the first thing we have to do is the outline of our shape in just a regular chain. You could do forward or reverse for the beginning of this, but as we move forward, it is easier, I find, to do the interlocking version while doing forward chain stitch. You can definitely try it out in reverse, but we're going to be doing it all in forward here because I just personally find it easier when you're having to go through the previous stitches to do it in the forward style. And if you are unsure of how to do chain stitch itself, I have a great tutorial on that. It was the very first stitch we covered in this tutorial series, so I will link that in the upper corner. Once we finished our outline with regular chain stitch, we're going to start filling it in line by line, going from the outside in. And what you're going to do is loop your first stitch underneath the stitch right next to it. So every new row of stitches is linked or interlocked with the row previous to it. And we're going to do that by just sliding our needle underneath one side of the previous loop. You don't want to go under both loops, or you're just going to pull the entire stitch towards the next stitch. But if you just go under the one side of that loop, you're pulling the stitch open rather than pulling the stitch towards you. So by going under just the one side of the loop, we're opening this stitch up, and in the end it's going to create an almost like net-like sort of pattern that's really pretty in my opinion, very cool looking. Now after sliding under that one side of the stitch, you're going to create the rest of your chain like normal. So you're going back down in the same place you came up, and then you're coming up at the end of that stitch, bringing your needle through the loop you've created to move on and create your next chain loop. And you're just going to continue doing that all the way around your circle, row after row, until you get to the center. So you're always sliding your needle underneath one side of the row of stitches right next to the one that you're doing, and then creating a normal chain loop from there. Now I will note that the closer you make your next row of stitches to the one before it, the tighter and more closed your interlocking chain fill is going to be. I've actually done it sort of semi-close in this. I'm not pressed right up against the line next to it, but I'm also not really far away. So in the end, you'll see that it has some nice sort of net-like holy pattern to it. Now you could go even further away than what I've done. Make your next row of stitches, have a nice solid gap between it and the previous row. And what that's going to do is give you an even more holy appearance at the end, with wider spaces in between all of your stitches that just give it a looser weave of a net sort of appearance. So it would be a fun one to play around with, move your stitches around and see the different ways that your texture changes according to the placement of your stitches. Now, out of all of the stitches that we've done so far, this one definitely takes the longest to complete, or at least it did for me. It'll take a shorter amount of time to complete if you place your stitches further apart from each other and do sort of that looser weave net look. But that is entirely up to you. Play around a little, settle in, give yourself some time to finish this. It looks great as the central shape in circle 3, especially as I did here. If you use variegated thread colors, I just think that looks extra cool on this circle. One thing I do want to note is that since you're filling in a shape from the outside in, you're going to be making smaller and smaller shapes as you go, and therefore you'll have to start skipping stitches. What I mean by that is, see how I'm sliding the needle underneath each of these little stitch sides. Always the previous row that I finished is the one that I'm sliding under. I started out doing the stitch right next to the one that I'm sewing now, and they all kind of line up with each other at first for the first 1 or 2 rows, but then you start to see as your circles or your shapes get smaller that your stitches are no longer perfectly lined up. They're overlapping each other more, and that means that instead of sliding your needle under the one right next to you, every once in a while you're gonna have to slide it under the next one up. You're gonna have to skip one of the chain loops and slide your needle underneath the side of the one next in line, so that you are creating the texture that you want, and so that you're able to finish off your circle with about the same size of stitches. If you continue to do the one right next to the one you're doing at the moment, your stitches are going to become smaller and crammed together. You could do that. It'd be interesting to see what happens, but it'll be a completely different texture, because that means if it took you 20 chain loops to get around the outside circle, you have to keep that same 20 chain loops on every circle after that, which means those stitches are going to be tiny by the time you're getting to the center. So to fix that, just every once in a while, skip one of the stitches and move to the next one in line, and that'll help you keep everything even and about the same size as you shrink through and get to the center of the circle. This one's pretty easy to finish off. Whenever you get to the very end of filling in your shape, whatever shape that might be, you're simply going to complete your last stitch like anything else by just tacking down that final loop with a small stitch. It totally disappears. It looks like the entire section has been filled in, and here you really can't even see where I finished. And there we go, that's gonna be it for today. It's a short one, we're just covering this one stitch. So thanks very much for joining us. Come back for the next tutorial video where we will be doing some wheat ear and rosebud stitches. If it sounds like we already did those, it is because we did already do the detached versions of those stitches in circle 1. Now we're gonna be doing the attached versions. Yes, like I said, we are covering every single possible variation, which means some of them are pretty similar to each other. But in the end, we are going to have a beautiful sampler to show for it. So thanks very much for joining me here, and I will see you for the next tutorial.